talk about the transformation of cars. You know, we talk about a different powertrain. We talk about how a car is becoming increasingly like a big iPad, a connected device. We talk about autonomous cars. We talk about flying cars. What is the transformation for airlines, for aviation? It's harder to see.
It's harder to see. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. It's hard to see, and it's hard to make. We've been flying aircraft with fuel or jet fuel for 100 years, and unfortunately, the technologies that are available in the future are still far away. We can foresee to hydrogen, and we can see electric. So let me just give you an example. Hydrogen is 3 times as energetically dense as jet fuel, but it's 9 times as less dense from a volume perspective. So that means that for carrying the same amount of energy, you would have to have 3 times the size of the volume to produce the same energy. So we would have to redesign completely the aircraft.
Hugely costly.
Hugely costly, and probably changing many of the infrastructure that we have today to be able to do that. Not only the airports, but also considering that we wouldn't need to have a network of hydrogen to be able to actually fuel the planes everywhere. Very hard. In the case of batteries, we would need probably 10 times the energy density by kilogram of weight if we wanted to fly on a long-haul flight on electric. So unfortunately, liquid energy in the form of jet fuel or eventually SAF is going to be the future, particularly in the long-haul flight.
Right, I definitely want to get to SAF. I'm a complete sustainable aviation fuel nerd, so we will get there. But first of all, if we're looking at these technologies, hydrogen, battery, is this the long-term future in your opinion? Will the technology get there, that it will be possible and it will be affordable and accessible for airlines?
I think it will, but it will be in the short haul, maybe up to 2,000 kilometers. For long-haul aircraft, so for intercontinental flights, I think for the time being, there is no technology that will be able to replace liquid fuels.
Right, let's talk about SAF. Now, I don't know how many of you are as excited by SAF as I am. I do a lot of panels in aviation, and this is probably my favorite topic. So SAF currently makes up 0.3% of global jet fuel. It's the tiniest amount, and yet this is really what the whole sector is betting net zero by 2050 on. This is going to be the biggest way to reduce emissions. We're nowhere near, in my opinion, that target. What would you say? Is it possible? Because I think IATA says that to reach net zero by 2050 using SAF, we'd need between 3,000 and 6,500 new fuel plants. It would cost $128 billion in capex a year between now and 2050.
Well, we are in the most difficult to abate industry in terms of CO2 emissions. And the only thing that we have in front of us today that it's possible is SAF. However, SAF today costs 3 times to produce as much as jet fuel, and the production is, as you said, less than 0.5% of what the world needs. It also has shortcomings. It has use of land that also impacts particularly food, and we would need to build a whole infrastructure to produce it, to carry it, but also a set of regulations that today don't exist. If I wanted to change today all of my consumption of jet fuel for SAF, imagine that I could.
And you're willing to pay for it.
I would be willing to pay for it if I could. It would mean that I would have to pay as much as I sell to do that. So the revenues of the whole airline would not be enough to pay for the jet fuel I need to carry. We have a huge task ahead of us. And there's 2 models today in the world. You can see what the US is doing, that they're trying to subsidize production, create incentives for making it more viable. And then you have the European model, which is mandates. And 70% of SAF produced today, it's produced in the US. In my perspective, that's a more viable model, because if we want to impose mandates on the industry, basically what we will see is that the people that need to fly the most, that can't afford it, the people that don't have the money to pay, will be the people left on the ground. We funded a study, very interesting study with MIT and Airbus to try to understand the potential of SAF in South America. And actually, the potential is huge. I mean, Brazil could produce SAF for maybe 10 or 20% of the world demand today. But let me tell you what the outcome of the report was. If we were able to consume 50% of our needs in SAF in 2050, the decrease in traffic would be equal to the size of our industries today in South America.
That's extraordinary. So it's unsurprising that an airline would prefer the carrot over the stick approach, I think. But you do say that it is actually working in the US in terms of how much SAF is being produced. What do we need to see in Latin America if it is a fantastic breeding ground for sustainable aviation fuel for that to happen?
I think what we need is public policies that incentivize production of SAF. Today, we have committed 3 years ago as Latam to try to find 5% of our consumption in SAF by 2030 by prioritizing production in the region. Today, not a single drop of SAF has been produced in South America yet, even though it has the biggest potential probably of production in the world. And why? Because we don't have public policies today that incentivize production or a clear picture of how to actually move, deliver, and consume SAF. So we have a huge challenge ahead of us. So it's very interesting to hear so many public policies here, particularly around mobility. Unfortunately, land mobility, not air mobility, that are changing the system very dramatically. In our case, in the industry as a whole, I would say, but in Latin America, we're at a slower pace.
But you do have targets. Chile, for example, has a target of SAF to reach. Is it realistic?
I don't think it's realistic. Chile is probably the country with the least ability to produce SAF. We simply don't have any ability to do it. Chile will very hardly produce SAF at all. Maybe we'll produce green hydrogen. Actually, Chile has probably the potential of producing green hydrogen in the best locations in the world in the south. But that's only hydrogen. Then you have to blend it in, you have to actually capture carbon from the atmosphere to produce SAF, and there's no technology viable for doing that yet. So one thing is to put their targets, the other thing is to make them achieve, and I think that what we're lacking is the honesty of saying that this is hard, much harder than what it looks.
When we look at the urban mobility picture more generally, we'll get back specifically to aviation, but urban mobility in Latin America, you don't really have high-speed trains. It's really driven by aviation, I imagine.
It's a huge geography. I mean, from the southern tip of South America to the northern tip of South America is like going from here, from Dubai to London. We have mountains, we have rainforest, we have a very diverse, complicated geography, and we have low density of population if you compare it to Europe, for example. So we don't have any other means. And actually, for many, many people in our region, air transport is the only way to get some very basic things like good medicine, for example.
Do you think this will change? Do you see a broader mobility picture developing in Latin America?
I don't think that we will see other modes of transportation in the long distances because we simply don't have the ability to produce that infrastructure. And I don't think it would be actually economically feasible. So air transport is going to be needed, and every day so more. Latin America has actually transformed itself. We have tripled the size of the air industry in this century. But we're still very far from developed economies. For example, in the UK or the US, you have approximately 2.5 passengers per inhabitant. We are at 0.5. So it's a very immature industry still, but one that requires a lot of efficiency to make it available for the population that has never flown. 85% of people in Latin America have never taken an aircraft.
Where would you like to see the investment in Latin America for aviation?
Well, I think it's a combination of infrastructure on the one side and public policies that allow for airlines to invest. Let me just give you an example. In Colombia, we have more taxation on the ticket than the price of a ticket itself. So if you pay $100 for the ticket, more than 50% of that is taxation today. So there's a number of things that need to be changed to develop the industry, which has a huge potential. And actually, when you hear Airbus, Boeing, IATA long-term numbers in terms of growth, Latin America ranks the second or the third after Africa and after Asia in terms of potential growth.
So a really exciting market for investors to get involved in.
It is an exciting market in terms of the potential. We just need the public policies to make it really interesting for people to come.
Now, we've talked about energy. The other big innovation, of course, for all sectors is artificial intelligence. How is that being used in aviation?
I think that the most obvious way is in merchandising. So you will very soon see that you will simply talk to your phone and say, I want to go here or there, book me a hotel, get me a car, and the technology will do it. I think that airlines, it is fair to say that we should be aiming at making the first contact with our passengers at the door of the aircraft. Actually, there's no need today to interact with the passengers if the passengers don't want to, before actually arriving to the door of the aircraft. If you want to go to the VIP lounge, awesome, we'll get you there. But today the technology is available for doing that. And I think that in the next 3 to 5 years, we will see that the booking systems that we're used to are going to be completely changed.
So it's really quite consumer-facing, as you see it, almost personalizing people's trips, making things more efficient to get from A to B.
It's the obvious. I think that there's a huge potential in changing the way we run operations. In the case of Latam, for example, we're digitalizing our maintenance operations completely, and we're finding benefits that we would have never expected that we could find with technology. So I think that there's an interesting opportunity there. That's from an airline perspective. From an industry perspective, and we were talking earlier in another panel, I hear a lot about AI and automatization on ground, but airplanes have been flying themselves for 20 years. All of you have heard about autopilot, no? It's exactly the same. And actually, I think it's easier to think about how to manage flying than to go through a very busy street on a road here in Dubai or in London or in Shanghai, for the matter. The air traffic control system, though, it's obsolete. And airlines spend billions of dollars flying around, burning fuel, emitting CO2 unnecessarily. And I think that there's huge potential for transforming the way we manage the flying. And this is going to be necessary because as we see other modes, for example, eVTOLs and electric taxis and so on, how are you going to manage to have landing in an airport? And those are 4, 5, 6, 10 passenger machines. So if you want to feed a 300 or 400 passenger flight, you would need 15 or 20 of those landing per long-haul flight in your airport. How do you manage the air traffic control system of that? So we hear a lot about autonomous car today and in the panel. I am missing the topic of how are we going to organize the skies.
Okay, this is a topic I'm really interested in, both from the perspective, particularly flying taxis or flying cars, eVTOL, because I've seen them at every tech show I've been to, and I go to a lot of them, and I keep wondering, will they ever actually fly? And clearly in Dubai 2026, maybe we will actually see that happen, and I'll be the first to go in it. I'll be very brave. But you're right, there's going to have to be a huge overhaul in terms of air traffic control. What about if we have drones delivering things through the skies to everyone's home? So how will that happen, and will it happen? Do you think it's realistic that we will have aviation in very small scale in cities?
I think it's, from a technological perspective, completely realistic. I think we have tackled technical problems harder than those already in humanity. This is clearly not going to be our most difficult task. I think that there's a lot of safety that needs to be taken into consideration. I think that there's a lot of bureaucracy, unfortunately, that will need to be eased out for this to happen. Of course, there's issues like threats and how do you fly across areas that are sensitive and so on. How do you manage not to interfere with other things? But at this point in time, I think that those things are all feasible to be tackled technologically. It's just a matter of organizing it.
We were talking with some people earlier this morning on a panel, and what was really clear is that things that are possible in China and perhaps Dubai and maybe California are simply not possible elsewhere. Are we going to see huge innovation in tiny pockets of the world which will just attract all of the investment, the startups, the skills?
Well, I think that's the tasks that governments have in front of them. The most impressive thing I've seen in these panels today is the willingness of the UAE government of transforming itself and making itself viable for business and how to tackle the future. In the countries where I live, this is very, very far away still from a thinking process. I think that the countries that will win are going to be those governments that enable and allow technology to be developed faster, because this is moving at such a speed that the people that find a way of enabling it faster will get a head start and a couple steps ahead, and those steps are going to be longer and longer as this moves on.
Who is responsible for financing the future of aviation? Whether we're talking about sustainability or just improving the experience, is it airlines, is it governments, is it the passenger?
Well, the most important change this industry will happen, if we move to 2050 and we look back and we ask ourselves what is going to be, or what was the biggest challenge of the industry in the first half of the century, it's not going to be COVID. It will be the decarbonization of the industry. That's far more difficult than what we had to endure over the pandemic. But to do that, we need to spend so much money in transforming the way we consume fuel and then pay for it. And unless we find the technology today that we haven't found that makes SAF be more or less at the same cost of fossil fuel, jet fuel, unfortunately is going to translate itself into higher ticket prices. The customers will end up paying.
And inflation is already a problem for much of the world. What concerns you most in 2025? Looking at the geopolitical situation, deglobalization, I suppose we could call it, the rise of protectionism, what is this going to do for sectors like aviation?
I think the latest developments we've seen open huge question marks for the aviation industry. For example, tariffs. Will that hamper traffic? Would that hamper cargo? In what sense? There's a huge fleet of very old cargo aircraft. Will they get out of business all completely? So there's potential of changing the cargo industry significantly if tariffs hamper traffic, if they hamper trade. Otherwise, I think that this is a very healthy industry. I mean, who would have thought 3 or 4 years ago that we would have surpassed the levels of traveling that we had before 2019? If you just take 2019, 2024, forget what happened in the middle for a second, and you see the growth, it grew at 2 to 2.5%. So actually people want to fly. And probably people felt that their freedom, as it was impaired, hampered during the pandemic, they thought about it in a different way. And today I think that people are prioritizing experiences over goods, and that's good for air travel, that's good for tourism. I think that's good for the economies in general.
All right, last question. If you could imagine yourself flying in 50 years' time, how is it going to be different to today? With cars, I feel like it's easy to paint a picture.
I would love to tell you that I think it would be supersonic, but I'm not sure, to be honest. You're
allowed to dream.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to think about going back home instead of spending 22 hours too. It would be great. But no, I think that the advances are going to be not in time, they're going to be in the way we have our experience around flying, around traveling, embedding it more, making our passengers just feel that it's easier than what it was a few years ago, and that will be this year, today.
Well, time flies, and it is time for our next session. Thank you so much, Mr. Alvo. That was absolutely brilliant.